Hello, everyone. We are back, and we are now confronted with a new text, the essay by Isaiah Berlin, titled "The Hedgehog and the Fox," on Tolstoy, the Philosophy of History, I believe. That's the subtitle of the essay. This text was chosen by our friend Daniel Garner from OG Rose. Daniel, please give us some opening remarks before we start.
Well, gentlemen, I'm so, again, it's just so wonderful to be doing this reading group, because this is just an example of a text you read. I was looking at the date. I was telling you on the book, I was like, wow, 2011. And then 10 years later, reading the essay again and just getting it. It's so much richer. It's kind of deeper. I once heard someone say that some of the great works and the great thinkers you need to read at multiple points in your life, and you get something entirely new out of them. And that strikes me. And just so everyone knows, for years I've been saying Isaiah Berlin, and that is incorrect. That is an Americanization. It's Isaiah Berlin or Dr. Berlin. So I'll come out, and all those people over the years who knew I was pronouncing it wrong, who let me get by, I apologize. So Isaiah Berlin. Isaiah, I would say Dr. Berlin really comes, he's always really impressed me as a thinker, someone that was so, he would hang out with poets. He was respected in the philosopher world. He was also a very practical person. Politicians knew them. He was apparently a very kind person. Students loved him. He'd be invited on to the BBC to give these lectures on the movement out of Romanticism into the Enlightenment and the Counter-Enlightenment. And apparently he would write a bunch of notes on a note card. And then before he starts, balls it up, throws it over his shoulder, and give a 55-minute lecture off, out of his mind. And it was beautifully composed and put together. But he always also would give off an aura of really believing in the ideas and that they mattered, and that it was important that people heard them, and that they had these vistas unveiled to them. He was passionate about a lot of the Russian thinkers that people have forgotten. He was very passionate about the Counter-Enlightenment. He was passionate about Vico. He was passionate about these thinkers that had been forgotten by history. And he loved the great minds, but he also knew how the canon of great minds could hide some of the other great minds that had been forgotten. He was someone who would always look people in the eyes, but also didn't take things at face value, I suppose. He always would see something deeper that was going on. And just an extraordinary mind. This particular essay, I would say, is his most famous, The Hedgehog and the Fox, and it's based on a fragment from, and I can never pronounce the poet's name, if someone wants to, this fragment. Say it again, John.
Archilochus.
Thank you, sir. See, I couldn't even, I was saying Isaiah for so long, I needed that. So thank you, John. And it's that famous line, that fragment from the poem where he says, the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And he goes through and starts thinking about various literary thinkers as either being hedgehogs or foxes. For example, he puts Dante as being a hedgehog, Dostoevsky as a hedgehog, and he puts someone like Shakespeare is going to be a fox. And for example, in Dostoevsky, we see this in the Brothers Karamazov, this very interesting question of, was freedom, do people want freedom? Is freedom a good thing? And also the temptation of abstraction as opposed to particular people. And a lot of the book will orbit around this idea, and arguably can even sacrifice some of the narrative operations for the sake of this monotheory, is another phrase that I like. And in Dante, you have this operation of how grace has to gradually develop at every single layer of the divine comedy, Inferno, Purgatory, and in heaven, in order to pull people toward God. And there's this operation of the gradual revelation that is a key operating principle of Dante. Whereas in Shakespeare, we got your Othellos, you got your Cleopatras, you got your Macbeth, you have all these different people, and really, really focused on it's not that every single Shakespeare story has to connect with other Shakespeare stories. Shakespeare is going to be creating these incredible characters that are in this incredible play, and then moving on to Othello, and then moving on to Macbeth. The thing that really is so fascinating about this essay, that often I think can be forgotten when people are talking about it, is that it's really centering on this kind of tragedy with Tolstoy. Where Tolstoy is someone who Dr. Berlin says is a fox, but Tolstoy believes in being a hedgehog. He really believes in being a hedgehog. And the example that Isaiah, Dr. Berlin, gives is how in War and Peace, there's this theory of history that is an operation. This is kind of this idea that history does what it wants. It's very powerful in that, in light of the momentum of history, the determinism of history, which our dear Hayden White may not like so much, that these great men are not so great, actually, that they're just kind of being pulled along. That's not to say that freedom doesn't exist at all. But the funny line that Dr. Berlin has is that freedom is found in trivialities, not really in these big currents. But in War and Peace, you know, there will be these kind of these sections that are these philosophical musings on history to kind of put forth this this theory, where Dr. Berlin, and then I'll pass it on to John or Davood, whoever would like to take it next, where Tolstoy's brilliance lies in his ability to see all of the details, to see all of the little pieces, and to bring them out and have these beautiful characters and these beautiful scenes. You know, it's in another work by Tolstoy, but I never forget that part out of Anna Karenina where they're cutting the field with the scythes and going through just the details of how they clean the scythe. I was thinking about that before we began talking, and I can read that every year because of the extraordinary details that are brought out in some of the sections of Tolstoy. I think in War and Peace when they're out and cleaning in the river and he gets embarrassed. There are all these different scenes. It's just brilliant. But there's a kind of tortured spirit in War and Peace where you have to get in that monotheory, get in that hedgehog, that big theory of history there that is existing in tension with the genius of Tolstoy that are bringing out these different details. And so from there, Dr. Berlin will go forth. So it's wonderful to visit him again. I love this opportunity. He does so much in literature, philosophy. He really was, I would say, the thinker 10 years ago that I didn't even admittedly know that there was a thing called the counter-enlightenment. And then I run into this guy and I'm like, what's this? And that was a big deal. So it's wonderful to have this opportunity to return to him.
Davood, you go ahead.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm also very happy to be reading and discussing this text. Hopefully we will read and talk about a few essays by Professor Berlin. So I appreciate the continuity in the themes that we have discussed so far. The theme of counter-enlightenment and the critique of reason, the reason in the sense of the philosophical dominance over life. That has been with us since the beginning of since we started this group, discussing Hyde and White, and then Benjamin Fontaine. And now with Berlin, we get different expressions of that theme. Here we have a thinker who, as you said, Daniel, he is somebody who has a genius, who has a gift for realism and detail and paying attention to the texture of human life, human agency, human psychology, while at the same time, he is really convinced that grand philosophical and metaphysical theories, laws that are universal and general enough to help us make sense of not just particular situations, but generally all of our lives, or the trajectory that our lives might take. He really sees the importance in that, and he believes in the importance of that. So the hedgehog-fox theory that Berlin begins with, why it becomes more interesting is that the tension between fox and hedgehog, these two tendencies, are now present within one thinker, namely Tolstoy. And he's tracing that tension, exploring that tension within him. So he begins with criticisms of Tolstoy's War and Peace by people like Turgenev and Flaubert. They say, yeah, this guy is a genius. He's really good at describing particular situations, singular individuals, but he repeats himself too much and he philosophizes too much. So other literary authors really appreciated his descriptive, whenever he paid attention to individuals and particular actions. And I think often they were more critical of his philosophical aspirations. One last thing I mentioned before passing it to John is the connection with Hayden White. Hayden White talked about in, I think, the third essay that we discussed from Tropics of Discourse. He says that usually great thinkers embody a contradiction, that they have plans and aspirations. They have tendencies to give us an image of history, an image of human life, human societies that has a particular flavor, maybe tragic, maybe romance. They want to be, maybe they're inclined towards reductionism, or they're inclined towards representationalism. But really great thinkers, according to Hayden White, and that applies to Tolstoy here, embody a tension between two conflicting tendencies,
Mhm.
and that makes them great. That struggle with that inner tension. So yeah, I'll stop there and pass it to John for now.
The first thing I want to admit it right off the bat was that am I the only person here who's never read War and Peace?
No, I haven't.
Okay, you haven't read it either. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, at the risk of that being Daniel's next recommendation.
Yeah, why not?
I really sort of had to trust his interpretation of Tolstoy's own writing, and it sounds like what he's saying is that when he's writing this, I think in the 1860s, he is really trying to sort of pile the depths of his own imagination to look for a philosophy of history that he can really get onto the page. And all he really ends up doing is inventing characters whose details and whose minutiae he can readily get on the page. But when he gets to those philosophy sections, like Davood mentioned, with people like Turgenev and Flaubert, they mention how thin and how facile they seem. But he's reaching for something more. You can see that he's trying to synthesize these small little pieces to reach beyond what they seem superficially. And I guess towards maybe the end of the talk, we can talk about how those two parts are reconciled in him and why I think that reconciliation kind of seems like a cop-out to me. Mm-hmm. But as far as continuation in our reading, I thought that the idea of, he does mention that the hedgehog fox spectrum is a spectrum for everyone, but that most people sort of lean towards one way or the other, but that he might be towards the middle. One of the great thinkers of all time who was, closest to the middle. And I kept thinking back about maybe you can have all the details you want in a story, but it's just like a historian can have all the details they want about World War II or something. But unless you have something to couch it in, like, to steal Hayden White's word, implotment, maybe that hedgehog tendency is just sort of like a shape to interpret everything through. But of course, as he gets older, he goes through, he starts writing more and more like political and prophetic stuff. But I had always thought Tolstoy was, again, I've never read this, but I have read other things, Resurrection specifically, and I thought he was a Christian. And I would have thought for a Christian in the Orthodox Church that his Christianity would be kind of a hedgehoggy influence for his philosophy as history. I mean, obviously what happens at the end of history? Christ comes back, right? And rules for 1,000 years. He never even mentions his Christianity even once, I don't think, in the essay, which I thought was really perplexing. You don't have any?
Well, the Christianity of Tolstoy is a fascinating subject. Like, there was this one book, Philip Yancey, where he compares like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and I can't remember which one. Tolstoy's Christianity is kind of this interesting humanism where he doesn't believe in the divinity of Christ, but then he kind of does believe in the divinity of Christ. It's very, very confusing, and I'm not going to sit here and say that I can necessarily systematically explain the Christianity of Tolstoy, but it's absolutely the case that as Tolstoy gets older, he seems to get to a point where he almost thinks that writing, I don't know if I want to say it's a sin, but that it's kind of frivolous, that it's kind of not something he should be focused on, and that he instead should be doing, he writes a story like, I think, Alyosha the Pot, but it's considered one of his bad. It's not like a good story because it's become so, what's the term? Moral. It's like a moral tale, the everyman tale or something like that. We don't get any more of those short stories like, oh man, what's the one with the Curzak that goes fighting Hera? Dang it, it's got an H in it. It's an extraordinary work. But he that's it. Very good. That's amazing. And there's
the Kreutzer Sonata.
What's that, sir?
The Kreutzer Sonata. Didn't he write the Kreutzer Sonata?
I don't know. That what looks like I have work to do.
That might be
I mean,
Dostoevsky. I might be wrong.
I'm not sure. Well, the other thing with these great writers is as you get older, you learn that they wrote things you didn't know about. Apparently, Dostoevsky wrote some novel about a girl named Sonia. I didn't know about that. Maybe it's one he threw away or something, but I don't know. It's some girl with an umbrella named Sonia. Apparently, I didn't know about that. But there's something about where Tolstoy, and maybe this is kind of, the second time I read this essay, I was just really struck by this feeling of tragedy. I don't know, where Isaiah Berlin, it's almost like I don't want to get too much into all of Isaiah Berlin's thinking, but a lot of what Isaiah Berlin is resisting is, I think he calls it monadism, based kind of on Leibniz, which is a single theory by which to understand everything. He wants to defend pluralism, which is, but to define it clearly from relativism, where just, we can have different ideas of what we should do on a rainy day, but both of those are rational. You see it's raining outside, so you say, I'm going to stay indoors. You say you're going to stay indoors. I see it's raining outside, and I say, well, I'm going to bring an umbrella. Both of those are rational responses to a rainy day, but it's not relativism, right? And so, it's hard. It's almost like I read this and I see Isaiah Berlin going, buddy, Tolstoy, I'm going to make sure that no one ends up like Tolstoy again, where they are able to see value in a pluralistic, multifaceted way of life, and not to think that because you failed to create a system that it therefore doesn't have value. Because a critical component for the hedgehog, and then I'll pass it on to Davood, is, if I recall correctly, somewhere Isaiah says something like, for the monadic thinker, which would be the hedgehog, things only have value in so much as they fit into that system. If they don't fit into the system, they don't have value. Well, then if we think of Tolstoy, that's so tragic, because he's like the world expert at being a fox. And what he is a genius in, he cannot see value in. What he is a genius in, he cannot see value in because it doesn't fit into this giant monotheory of history. And the thing that he only sees value in is, if we take all the other literary the writers seriously, the thing he sees value in is the thing he's not that good at. And so that's kind of so tragic. And it's almost like I can see now, I guess I read this now, it's like Isaiah Berlin, it's almost like his whole philosophical project then becomes to assure that something like this doesn't happen again to some other future artist. And that was just something I was thinking about as I was reading this, that it not, because the first time I read it, you really kind of let that whole hedgehog fox split kind of come in, and you remember that as the mental model. But this time when I read it, the tragedy of Tolstoy really struck me. So that really struck it. But I like your question, John, on the Christian thing. I think Tolstoy's Christianity is a fascinating subject that I've never been able to get a real good hold on, but I think the point you're making is good. You would think that would be part of it.
Before Davood goes on, could I read? I think I might win the contest for the oldest version of the essay, by the way.
Yeah, you win. I got this 2000 thing.
It's just it's a paragraph. It's below the photo of our subject there, looking totally Oxford Donish. But this is George Steiner himself, was a great literary critic in the London Sunday Times. And he uses a lot of the same buzzwords that we have used so far about him. So I just wanted to write and say that combined, we are sort of like a George Steiner. The center of Isaiah Berlin's activities as a publicist and teacher is a passionate dispassion. He fears and detests those minds, those systems of conviction that seek to inflict on reality a single mastering answer, a single consuming goal or idea. He combats those who believe in a universal dogmatic revelation, be it historical or theological or social. Sir Isaiah is an ardent pluralist, a humane ironist, the antecedents of whose sensibility go back to the Enlightenment and the liberalism of the philosophes, the French philosophers. I read that and I thought, well, we've already used 3 or 4 of those words. So, I mean, we use relativism and irony and
yeah, tragedy.
And I mean, he's talking about Isaiah Berlin, but that would apply just as well, I think, to Tolstoy, or at least Berlin would think it would.
I remember a few lines about Tolstoy Christianity in this essay as something that happened towards the end of his life, and he was an attempt on his part to resolve this conflict that he lived for such a long time. I also remember while reading that Wittgenstein biography, that Wittgenstein was influenced by the later Tolstoy, the Christian Orthodox Tolstoy. I want to spend a bit of time on this notion of the conflict, the inner conflict that Tolstoy lived with. And I want to emphasize that we don't mean, John, you mentioned this idea of a spectrum. So the spectrum at the one end we have hedgehog, at the other end we have fox. And I used to hear this a lot whenever we discussed spectrums in graduate school. People said, yeah, on the one hand we have A, on the other hand we have B, and it should be somewhere in the middle. And that way of describing spectrums and being in the middle of a spectrum suggests a kind of peace that is not really true to the matters of fact. A person who has a combination of these two tendencies is living with the conflict between them, because these two sides of the spectrum are pulling him in different directions. And we might experience these in our own lives. And so I'm going to talk about why this can be a conflict, why these two tendencies, first, they give rise to each other. So one of them can give rise to the other tendency and then turn against turn against the first tendency, and then produce a conflict, and then maybe attempts to resolve it. So let's say in our own lives, we can have domains or concepts like friendship, like marriage, like scholarship. So we can have particular experiences in this domain, the domain of friendship. And because of these particular experiences, gradually, based on these experiences, something like a theory of friendship will emerge in our minds. So instead, let's say in my mind, I equip myself with a theory of friendship based on my particular experiences. So I take an extra step to generalize, to imagine abstract and universal regularities and laws of friendship. So this is how things work in general, not just in my life. So why that results in tension and conflict is because those theories are not going to always be confirmed in my experience. I will continue to have concrete, particular experiences with concrete and particular individuals that I am in friendship with, I share that relationship with, and occasionally I will encounter an anomaly that doesn't fit into my theories. So in those cases, I can choose to ignore what doesn't fit, or I can force the experience to fit into my theory if I'm really, really attached to the theory, and I'm really proud of it for whatever reason. Maybe I'm by nature inclined towards having theories more so than being faithful to particular experiences. And maybe because there's a comfort in that. There's a comfort in being mono-theoretical, at least in one domain. And I think that kind of conflict, when it shows up in a grand domain like human societies, human culture, and history, I think it's the force of it and the burden that it becomes. It can be really, it can bother someone. It can bother someone like Tolstoy. You can imagine how, for him, it is really a problem. It's a problem. He wants to have those grand theories, universal theories. He wants to make sense, not just of particular events, but in general of life and history, while seeing the concrete texture and particularity of these agents that he's writing about. So he did a lot of research for his writing of War and Peace, as we read in this essay, but he didn't necessarily stay true to all of these, the research that he did. Occasionally, he changed the story in order to fit maybe some theoretical stance. So that is really interesting. So I think that conflict is, I think we would agree that it is, we can describe it as a midpoint along a spectrum, but it really shouldn't distract us from seeing it as a conflict. So that's it for me.
I was, I guess the scientist, the science part of my mind kicked in, and he was talking about in maybe the first half of the essay, how the things Tolstoy was reading and all of the sort of philosophers of history and the sociologists that he was reading, who were trying to give this sort of Fox-like answer to the philosophy of history, and he was just reading them one after the other and just dismissing them for their arrogance, their their just superficiality, etc. Their inability to see the whole picture. And I guess what's really hard for me to imagine as someone who is probably equally steeped in science as he is in the humanities, it seems like he wanted to believe something, that he had falsified so many things that he saw, right? I mean, I can read this book about this sort of my own personal ideas, which take priority for me, or human ideas and human passions take priority over theories. And if one of my theories or ideas or passions just comes into conflict, well, then I can just easily dismiss this. It seems like he has dismissed a lot of things, but he still wants to believe in something for which he doesn't have any evidence. And that's the conflict there is that he's such a positivist in some ways, which is a word that Berlin throws away. He's such an empiricist, but despite how many things he's thrown away, he's still looking underneath every single rock to make sure that he hasn't missed something. And it almost seems like at the end of the day, when he tries to reconcile the two, when he talks about wisdom of just not knowledge of historical events or theories about or history, but having a sort of knowledge about how things go. It's a very short section, but how that is that's his sort of hedgehog approach, knowing that having the sort of wisdom or insight into how things work in the world that maybe smart people don't have, but that truly wise people have. I would be interested in seeing what you two thought about that section in the book. And I'm also curious about if anyone is familiar with Joseph de Maistre, the person who is sort of drug along in the essay along with Tolstoy, if you have any opinions about him, because he was something else too.
Well, alas, I don't have any interesting opinions about that. So let's pray that Davood can pick up the slack, alas. But that would be fascinating. I think what you just said was really interesting, because it does make me think a little bit about Tolstoy's Christianity, because I recall some of the letters where there are sections that just doesn't fit. Like there are parts of the Bible that just don't fit with his interpretation of who Jesus was, that he basically is like, well, those must have been put in there. Those don't really matter. Those don't really count. Any evidence that like Jesus was not merely just focused on, say, moral teaching. It's a little more complicated. The famous example of like Thomas Jefferson cutting out all the parts of the divinity of Jesus. It's a little more complicated than that, but it's kind of like that. It's like, well, that wasn't really part of what they saw. This is the truth. And there's something where it's like he's it's so like there's no way that Jesus could have actually been divine or anything, and so you just kind of assume that it wasn't. So anything that suggests that cannot be correct. Well, that is a jump that you're making. Rather you're right or wrong, that is a jump that you're making. And there's a few things. It's almost like, is Tolstoy alive at a time where basically you're made to feel that if you don't present a grand theory, that your work is not going to be taken seriously? There's some kind of cultural questions that one have where you're kind of under a pressure. It is so tragic to think that Tolstoy may have thought that what he is gifted in is not something that has value, that can only have value in the context of presenting with it some sort of great theory. The thing that's interesting to me is to wonder, you get the impression that there could have been if Tolstoy would have gotten his act together, those sections that are metaphysical musings in War and Peace would have been left out, and you get a sense that the book would have been better. But an interesting question is to suggest if actually the greatness of War and Peace required those sections to create the tension that then drove Tolstoy to creating these extraordinarily detailed characters and these things. Because it's almost like, I guess I want to say, if we have this idea that history history goes along and it's going to do what it's going to do because it follows more laws, if you will, then you need your characters to be larger than life and yet still crushed by history to function as really good evidence that history is all powerful. Like if your characters weren't that good and if the events were not described and really would thus create the impression that characters should be able to change the course of history, then when you present a theory of history that shows that it kind of goes along regardless of what people do, it wouldn't have any power. So is it precisely because of Tolstoy's macro theory of history that then incentivizes him to create such extraordinary plot and characters and people, and therefore it would not be possible for War and Peace to be the same novel without those sections? I don't know. That's a question I've got in my head. It's a curious thing where we always like to, we always like to think you could get rid of that and keep the good. Maybe not. Maybe that's part of the lesson of Tolstoy. Maybe you can't have Tolstoy unless they're facing that conflict. Is it the same as the dialectic in a Hegelian sense? Every talk I got to bring it at least once. Or do you not need that conflict? That's an interesting question I have thinking about it. And I also want to know, we talked about positivism. There is something here that makes me feel like Berlin sees a little bit of himself in Tolstoy and kind of back and forth, this kind of where Berlin doesn't quite for example, Berlin wants to resist any monotheory. And the big monotheory in Berlin's day is in fact positivism, right? This kind of doctrine of science that, he has a big debate with A.J. Ayres on verification and meaning. And it would have been so easy for Berlin to have simply gone with the positive narrative. But he in fact saw that as another example of a monotheory where all meaning can be found in something that can be verified. And, the famous example is A.J. Ayres kind of says something doesn't have meaning unless you can verify it. And Berlin, you kind of he's like, well, if I tell you it's raining outside, you know what that means before you go and look. Things have meaning before you verify them. And with really just an incredible slap across the face, the entire link of verification and meaning is really, really, really hurt. But how much easier would have been if Berlin would have just gone along with that and sort of accepted that and gotten and kind of fit in quite well with all of the academics in his day. But he's resisting that sort of urge, whereas perhaps Tolstoy could not resist the narrative. And maybe Berlin also is because of the example of Tolstoy, he's able to learn from that. So I see kind of a conversation also between Berlin and Tolstoy that I kind of want to write on. I was taking notes because it's interesting that the essay feels very personal to me. There's something very autobiographical almost that is an operation going on that I want to kind of think a little more on. That was kind of coming to me as I was reading it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, great.
He does play his cards very close to his chest, though. He never really. I felt exactly the same thing, but he never leads you to believe. He never starts a sentence out with "I sympathize with Tolstoy because," but you nevertheless get that feeling.
That is, I think, the best way to talk about yourself is by, in a latent way, secretly talk about yourself by talking about somebody else that you deeply sympathize with.
Yeah, his biographer, whose name we were trying to think of, Michael, he mentions that Isaiah would never talk about it. He would always be talking about other people, how the biographer really had to kind of get him to tell a story about his friends. And that was the way he could get information about himself. So it seems that was also part of how he lived.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What I sensed as I was listening to you both was I picked up a couple of things. One of them is this: having a gift in Tolstoy case is the gift of realism, realistic description. And that was really something that he could do. He had a genius for that, so to speak. And because it came so easily for him, maybe he underestimated the value of that gift and he took it for granted. And he maybe overvalued the thing that came to him with more difficulty. So he didn't have a gift for theorizing, but he valued it because it was harder for him. So he used his gift to continuously falsify instances of that other thing that he wanted, but he couldn't get. So for example, a grand sociological theory or historical theory that he really yearned for, he would see a case and he would use his gift to say, okay, this is not it. That's related to what John said. John talked about the ongoing activity of falsification. So he does criticize other sociologists and theorists, historians who have these grand theories, and he gets angry with them, and he harshly treats them. And that is a sign maybe that he wants their projects to be successful. It is precisely because he wants them to succeed, and he wants something like that to succeed, that he gets angry and he regards them as foolish, that they might think, oh, John, you're mute. You have to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry. No. He's so smart that he sees through them.
Right.
And he can't let himself, he can't hide his intelligence. He can't lie to himself and say, yes, you found the answer. He must, from his own intellectual integrity and honesty, say this is not so.
Despite the fact that he wants something like that to work out.
Despite the fact that he wants it.
But it cannot be that easy for him. So he cannot be satisfied with that simplistic version of the solution. So it's because he values the hedgehog style that he doesn't want a bad he's sensitive to bad hedgehogs. I think that's something that we might also observe in ourselves. Sometimes when we disagree with someone, we might not have a very negative reaction or get emotional about that disagreement, but sometimes we see someone who is sympathetic to our position, but he's doing a bad job, maybe defending that position or expounding that position. And that might get us more angry because that person is on our side and supposed to defend the thing that we also believe in, or fulfill a task or a project, a kind of project that we also want to see and want it's succeeding. And when it is being done poorly, then we get upset. So that emotional reaction, that is something that John pointed out. I think it is also telling and important to pay attention to. Yeah, that's it.
Well, I just wanted to note on what you were saying. I think so I knew in wrestling there was like this one individual who was like extraordinary, just had incredible ability, just very natural, and they never came to practice and they never tried, precisely because it was like easy for them. And so they were terrible. They ended up actually, they could have probably won state, a lot, and they didn't because they had that gift. I have seen time and time again from personal experience, people who I think are incredibly gifted at writing and description, they never do it because precisely because it's kind of easy to them. And that dynamic that you're describing, where people tend to value what they're not good at, to value what they're not good at and to not value what they're good at, that absolutely is at play. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is absolutely what I've kind of thought in Tolstoy, where when I look at Dostoevsky, what's so interesting about Dostoevsky is I don't think there's any doubt that he did not have the descriptive ability that Tolstoy had. And Dostoevsky, but what's very interesting, Dostoevsky was an obsessive editor as well. A lot of people say that he was not a good writer. He didn't really care. No, he was an obsessive editor. He just didn't have that magic ability that, say, Tolstoy had. But Dostoevsky kept trying. And I would say that the Grand Inquisitor and the Brothers Karamazov, even though it is not artistically, in my opinion, as consequential as like an Anna Karenina, for example, I think about the Brothers Karamazov all the time, simply because he did not quit, simply because he kept trying, and simply because he kept going. He saw value in the writing, because maybe it was precisely because Dostoevsky did not have the same natural ability as did Tolstoy, that he kept at it. Maybe he had the curse of a hedgehog, but actually I would argue as you go through Dostoevsky, he comes out of that. And then you get to the Brothers Karamazov, where arguably each brother is a kind of fox. It's more of a fox structure, because they have different ideas and different ways that he's structuring. Now, I would have to write that paper, but the point I'm getting at is that dynamic you're describing, I actually think that's very much at play. And I see that. And I actually, for anyone listening to this, what you think doesn't matter might be what you're really good at. So stop thinking that way, and don't be, put some faith in it, because you don't want to do that to yourself, where you miss out on what you can do because you think that because it's easy, it doesn't have value. That it's worth working at and cultivating, because you could take it to even greater levels.
But then if he could just stop thinking that way, he wouldn't have that tension. And then where would we be?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that goes back to the tension thing.
Yeah.
Well, what I would say is it's almost like there's a ditch on the other side of the road. I think Tolstoy, was it like 10, 20? It was a long time where he never wrote like anything between War and Peace and Anna Karenina. And then he didn't write basically any more fiction. I think he went through a phase where he like did shoes or something. Like he like got really into making shoes. And he did that for a really long time. By all means, I think the spirit of not assuming what you're doing is good because then you get overconfident. But then it's almost like there's a difference between that's healthy because you're like not assuming you're the greatest thing since sliced bread, and a spirit of not valuing what you're doing. So then you stop it. So you want the tension, but you don't want to take it so far that then you like don't do it because it doesn't matter or something. So those are two dynamics I'll have to think on.
I didn't know about the shoe thing, but maybe this is just me being my cynical self. But I thought it is very much like Tolstoy, who is from, Russian aristocracy, minor Russian aristocracy, but to, romanticize the life of a Russian peasant living out.
He absolutely did. Yes. Yes.
It's very easy to do when you have a 500, square foot, well-heated home to go home and raise your family in. Less romantic when you don't.
By contrast, By contrast, I think that Dostoevsky wasn't as rich. I think he had also a gambling problem, so that kind of helped with his writing to rush and finish the books. To get
David Foster Wallace actually has a tremendous. I actually really always liked Mr. Wallace's essays and Consider the Lobster. He has a tremendous essay on the life of Dostoevsky, and it actually is fascinating to compare the lives of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and to see their fiction in light of that. Now, I could get carried away on that subject because I really find that really fascinating, but it's an interesting thing to consider.
George Steiner, the guy I just quoted from the back of the book, he has an entire book called Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, an essay in comparison. So
really?
Yeah, it looks at all their books and just sort of talks about them comparatively.
I'm writing a sticky note. I want to look at that.
I wrote it down too. Yeah, that's great. So I also wanted to say I have not read anything directly by Joseph de Maistre, but the discussions here, it's like he comes close to Tolstoy in some respects, but they don't really agree with each other because de Maistre wants to kind of respond to human irrationality. If I got it right, he wants to respond to the fact of human irrationality or the irrational sides of the human mind and human life by insisting on the necessity of traditions and institutions, old institutions that we submit to, because we are the kinds of beings that want to submit and follow orders, and so we need masters, basically. That's my caricature version of the Meister.
And our fallenness, our theological fallenness too, because he's a huge advocate of the church, and he's at a time, he's living at a time, in the late 18th and early 19th century where the Catholic Church is quickly losing respectability and authority in Europe. He played a big part in the Congress of Vienna after the Battle of Waterloo, when Napoleon lost his final battle and he was exiled. He was there at Vienna, sort of recarving up Europe. But he's known as a really, really in fact, I reviewed a book a few months ago called Conservatism, A History. It came out from Princeton University Press. And the author opens up the book with about a 40 or 50 page essay, and he couches the beginnings of conservatism with two thinkers, de Maistre and Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke probably makes sense. De Maistre does too, except he's much more reactionary, religious, and sort of old-timey conservative. Extreme, like, he basically thinks, we should be living in 1400. That's kind of an overstatement, but not much.
More like 1450,
1450, yeah.
That's an overstatement.
But I mean, he's very, very staunchly anti-democratic with a lowercase d. He's very pro-monarchical. hates seeing the shrinking empires all across Europe, that sort of thing. A very like I said, even for the 19th century, when you had your really conservative statespeople and diplomats, he was probably one of the most conservative, even more conservative than people like Metternich.
Right. So that position can only arise out of a general theory about human nature. Somebody who doesn't have a grand theory cannot be so confident in such a position.
Well, that's one of the things that a lot of people say that conservatives have, is that conservatives, when it comes to human nature, emphasize human limitations and human imperfections. And that one of the things about liberalism, if you want to sort of present them as a dichotomy, is that liberals tend to think about the perfectibility of humankind, where conservatives emphasize the imperfectibility and the fallenness of man.
Anyways, sorry, Daniel. Quickly, I wanted to mention the other place that I have seen the Meister's name is in Greg Sadler's book on the debates in France over Christian philosophy.
I thought that was from the 1830s, though.
Dr. Sadler.
Yeah, Dr. Greg Sadler. The 1930s Christian philosophy debates in France.
Yeah, the Meister was dead by then.
He's part of the context.
Okay.
Yeah, part of the context of the atmosphere of the debates.
Dr. Sadler, that was like a father of philosophy too. Remember, he was like the first. Dr. Sadler, I remember seeing that like 10 years ago. Man, when he started his Hegel theory, I mean, I was like, wow, this extraordinary individual. Well, what I was going to say is one of the Isaiah Berlin is so fascinating because one of the things he kind of is trying to do is to present a theory of liberalism that can give it, I want to say that gives it form without being a unified theory, because that would be a hedgehog, but also to where it's not just based on, say, utopian perfectionism, because he's seen where that form of liberalism can give you the totalitarianism of Russia. That's why it's so fascinating that he wants to create this doctrine of pluralism, which is not relativism. That is the key distinction in Isaiah Berlin, and that's the conditionality. And then he's going to come up with the, that we'll talk about next time on the theories of freedom and different kinds of liberty and so on and so forth, where I guess that's a similar tension that I see, that he doesn't want to end up in a Tolstoy place where you feel like, oh, I have to have a ground theory to justify what I'm doing. But then on the flip side, he understands the advantage that conservatism can have in having that unified vision. But unified visions can give you totalitarianism and can be oppressive in different things. And so, so he sees in Tolstoy someone who has that if we have the liberal vision, dare I say, of the working, he does indeed admire the working class. That's why some of the most beautiful freaking scenes in Tolstoy are of the working class. So much of his nonfiction are praising the working class, that the spirit is of the age. One of the reasons he wants to kind of suggest that great men can't do anything much about history is precisely to put the emphasis on the working person. That's where you find, he'll talk about the kingdom of God and the spirit that is in the working class. So you put the emphasis on there. And he wants to move away from a grand theory to something that's going to make space for the working class, but not at the same time lead to these different totalitarians. So that's to say, the liberal spirit is more open to different kinds of people, different kinds of diversity, different kinds of classes. He has the scene I mentioned in Anna Karenina. That's Prince Levin, if I can never say it, Levin, who comes out to work in the fields and he wants the class to close. But then you need a theory to make that possible, and that becomes pluralism, which is it gives form, but it's simultaneously open. Isaiah Berlin believes in the power of the state, but he also knows that the state is something you have to defend people from. That kind of bothness, a conservative and liberal impulse that is an operation. And so I think trying to actually provide a liberal vision, if you will, that is not merely utopian, but also is advancing, that's actually kind of has a moral progress to it, is something that makes Isaiah Berlin so extraordinary as a thinker. Because he also simultaneously, as he's doing that, he's respecting the impulse and the counter-enlightenment to respect tradition. Tradition matters. That's something that can keep rationality from becoming deconstructive and taking but too much. But at the same time, there's a difference between the haughty dare I say, monarchy tradition that's oppressive, and a tradition that's based on the working class or the everyday man, and the traditions of the working person and the rituals of going out in the field and cutting the hay every fall. That's a kind of tradition, but it's different from oppressive attrition. So that's where I just think Isaiah Berlin's an extraordinary thinker, precisely because he is operating in those spaces.
As I was reading, I also noticed another kind of maybe inspiration for your work. He also does, like, notices and brings to our attention the idea of trade-offs,
Yes.
which I've seen also in your work. Sorry, John, did you want to add something?
Well, I just wanted to say I knew that he had written about De Maistre somewhere else, and I just looked it up. If anyone is interested, he wrote a book called, well, he didn't write it, one of his students who compiled the lectures wrote a book called Freedom and Its Betrayal, 6 Enemies of Human Liberty. The last essay in there is on De Maistre.
Really? It's good to know.
Short little 30-page essay, but that's where I remember reading about him, and of course the book that on conservatism too.
Yeah.
And also, I just really quickly, if anyone is interested in this, I don't know if I think Russian Thinkers is not on sale, but Princeton University is having its 75% off sale for it ends next Monday. This is Monday the 21st. It ends a week from today. They have at least 3 books by Berlin for 75% off, which usually ends up being something like $6 or $7 a piece.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, that's great.
Including a series of personal impressions, I think is the book, is what it's called, and it's a series of biographical sketches of famous people that he knew, philosophers and poets and artists and things like that, which I snatched up because I've never seen in a bookstore before. But in case anyone out there is like us, nerdy,
nobody's like us.
I just wanted to let everyone know that that deal is out there if you want to go snatch it up.
Right.
It's a very good deal.
Yeah, it is. For my part, there's one last thing I wanted to touch on. Towards the end of the essay, he talks about the way War and Peace ends, the state in which the characters, we leave the characters. And again, this is not something I've read. I haven't read yet, War and Peace, but I trust Berlin's description. So he says that towards the end, the main characters, or some of the main characters, we leave them in a state of contentment. So they are not unhappy. They are happy with their understanding, and it's difficult to express what it is exactly that they understand. This was, for me, a key moment in the essay, that these characters understand something at the end of a journey, but it's difficult to say what it is that they understand. So in response to that, Berlin says that they're understanding a general sense of the interconnected nature of things, that we are all in relation to each other, and the concrete texture of our reality, the reality of moment to moment living. And that, with really grasping that, comes a kind of wisdom and a kind of maybe a peace of mind, a contentment that, okay, I have my agency, I can act, I can decide. I'm not completely crushed under the laws of history and society, but there are also huge limits, the really major limits to what I can do. And that is a kind of reconciliation that I think, at least maybe not in Tolstoy's own life, but towards the end of War and Peace, I think we reached that state. So I thought that was beautiful and important.
Oh, well, what's interesting about it is there's something about that suggests that the characters find, it's almost like they get the state of peace that Tolstoy himself is looking for, that if he can find that grand theory, there's kind of a feeling that he would have. And he never finds it, but his characters do. And to me, what I guess is part of the tragedy is actually, again, I just always go back to that scene where they're cutting. That part where they're cutting the field. Tolstoy saw it. Like, that's what he needed to go do. Like, he is coming from an Enlightenment tradition where the serenity comes from the right ideas, but he himself describes where that the most spiritual moments, and if to use that language in his text, are when people are lost in an experience, when they're lost in the feeling of the scythe cutting down the hay and the sounds of it dropping on the ground, or the guy wetting his scythe blade in the river, or falling asleep listening to the birds. Like if he would have understood that serenity that it's looking for doesn't come from having the right ideas, but from going into and living the right story, which he himself could have observed. If he could have done the things that he observed, he could have had what his characters have had. And Berlin, I think, then becomes passionate about putting forth a philosophy that takes down the primacy of the Enlightenment precisely to open up people to living a life so that they can go and cut the field like Tolstoy's characters did, that he himself did not do, so that we don't make that mistake, so that we're more like the characters we see in Tolstoy, as opposed to the tortured author who's haunted by an enlightenment that he didn't need to always try to bring with him.
Beautiful. Beautiful. John, any final words? Okay, great. I look forward to the next essay. I think it is two concepts of liberty, or maybe let's just mess it up. 4 concepts of liberty.
That's what I said last time. There's the 4 essays on the 2
liberty and its betrayals.
You're very kind, because last time I was like 4 concepts. Like, no, wait, liberty's in there. It has something to do with freedom and stuff.
Right. Close enough. Close enough. All right, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
Bye.